Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to this. This is our first webinar of 2026, first EUHealthGov webinar of 2026. It's great to see such a wide-ranging audience, some familiar names to us and those who are possibly joining us for the first time today. So just a little bit about EUHealthGov, and I'll just share some slides here. So hopefully you can see the slides and still hear me. Can someone just confirm that's the case, please?
Yes, all good.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So EUHealthGov, we've been running since 2021. We're an interdisciplinary network bringing together academics and policy practitioners. We're funded by the University Association for Contemporary European Studies, UACs, and also by the Erasmus programme of the European Union, and we acknowledge that funding very gratefully. The network's co-convened by Dr. Charlotte Gajewski of City St George's, University of London, who's also on the call today, and myself, Dr. Mary Guy, and I'm based at Trinity College, Dublin. EUHealthGov, we've got a social media presence. We're on Blue Sky and LinkedIn. We're no longer on Twitter. We also have a website, euhealthgov.org, where you can join our mailing list if you want to find out more about our events. We're going to be recording this webinar. We usually do this and then make recordings available on the EUHealthGov webinar website afterwards. So because of this, we ask the audience to make sure that they're muted to help support the smooth running of the webinar. But there will be time at the end to ask questions. You can do this via the chat, by the Q&A, or by unmuting at the end as well. So today we're delighted to celebrate the launch of Public Health, Markets and Law. This is a symposium of the Journal of Law, Medicine and Ethics of the American Society of Law, Medicine and Ethics. So over the course of the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to be giving a taster of the range of papers in the symposium, covering diverse topics of pharmaceuticals, access to medicines, pandemic responses, and competition policy. We've got a full range of speakers with us this afternoon, and including various countries, from Ireland, from Spain, from the Netherlands, and from the UK. The symposium is available open access. The link's available in the information about the webinar. And without further ado, I hand over to Dr. Mina Hosseini and Professor Imelda Maher as the guest editors of the symposium. So Imelda and Mina, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Mary. I will be very brief as I know time is very concentrated. I just want to thank you for launching us. It's great to be doing this, and also, of course, to our contributors for coming along, as well as for bearing with us as editors during the process. And I just want to reflect for 2 seconds on where we've come from, if you like. This is very much a product of COVID times. I always think COVID for some was a bit of a dreamland, you know, didn't have to go into work, could pursue your own interests for a while. And of course, it was a nightmare then for others. And emerging from that different perspective, we either want to run away from it or may need to turn to face it. So this, to some extent, is Mina's whole Marie Curie fellowship was all about turning to face COVID, to look at the past, to reflect on the present and think about the future. And these papers, to some extent, emerge from that process and mark the culmination of 2 years' work, actually, in terms of the project. There are 3 themes that for me emerge from the papers that you're going to hear about today. And just to rise above, I suppose, the more specific papers, these are in particular the notion of time. Lawyers in particular, but I suspect other disciplines as well, time is implicit in everything we write about, everything we think about, but we rarely talk about it in and of itself. So this temporal quality is particularly significant when we're talking about the interface of markets and intellectual property rights, where property is very much associated with, I think, notions of time. And the second theme then for me is the relationship between the state and markets. And you can't have markets without the state. And yet the state is often presented as something that is in opposition to markets. And we see some of the papers exploring that dynamic of that relationship between the extent to which there are boundaries or should be boundaries or where they should be in relation to the public and the private. And I would suggest that it's really a relational space rather than one where we have to put firm boundaries in. And the third question then is that, or third theme for me from all these papers, is one of interest. This is about public health. Public, which public? Whose publics are we talking about? Are we talking about European publics? There is a strong European focus in the papers. Or are we extending well beyond that? And are we ethically obliged to extend well beyond that in our considerations? And more specifically, are there particular publics that we need to pay attention to because of they are minorities within our states or within the union, and hence deserve particular focus and attention so that they can fully participate and fully embrace the concept of health and of markets within our societies. And on that basis, I'll hand over to Mina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Imelda. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much, Mary and Charlotte, for organizing and moderating this session. It's a pleasure to introduce the symposium, which grows out of the Public Health, Markets and Law International Workshops held at UCD Sutherland School of Law in September 2023 and again in September 2025. These workshops were organized as part of my Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship, CONFA Crisis Project, and funded by the European Union, and to create a space for this sustained interdisciplinary exchange at a particularly important policy crossroads. So across both events, both workshops, we brought together scholars and practitioners from public health, law, business, sociology, ethics, as well as colleagues at different career stages. So this mix was deliberate because many of the most difficult questions in contemporary health governance sit precisely at the boundaries between disciplines. So looking at them from only legal perspective, from only one perspective, risk missing both underlying problems and the possible solutions for the future. So the conversation were at times challenging. Sorry, can you hear me?
No, yes.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem.
You're back.
Sorry. These conversations were at times challenging. Participants returned repeatedly to familiar questions between innovation and access, and you can see these in all of these papers, and between national decision makings and global responsibilities, EU responsibilities, between market logic and social solidarity. The themes that you can see in many of these papers. At the same time, these workshops and papers revealed a strong shared interest in developing more balanced and workable approaches in governance of public health. So this symposium reflects a collective review process that grew directly out of those discussions in our two workshops. So these papers were refined through workshops, feedback, and continued engagement among contributors. So what emerged is an ongoing conversation about how legal and regulatory frameworks can better support equitable and resilient public health system in a market-driven work. One clear takeaway from our workshops and also our symposium is the global health challenges are becoming more structurally complex. Addressing them requires us to move beyond disciplinary silos, beyond just legal analysis, and combine legal analysis with economics, with ethical and public health perspectives. This contribution gathered here aim to support that broader conversation that we are very grateful that we had that in our symposium. Also, finally, Imelda and I were gratefully acknowledge the support of the European Union MSCA project and funding, and also generous support of UCD Sutherland School of Law in organizing our workshops and also publishing our symposium. We also thank the editorial team at the American Society of Law, Medicine Ethics, also Nicole Gustavs, Katie Johnson, Aaron Kesselheim in editorial board of the journal, as well as our colleagues, Una Breen, Susan Kingstone, Susan Darcy, Lauren Page, Rachel Brady, also Diletta Danieli, and Dr. Wu from Birmingham University, our colleagues at CCPC, and many participants and collaborators and reviewers of these papers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mina and Imelda, for that wonderful introduction to what's clearly been a very fruitful and engaging and beneficial project. So to begin our speaker presentations, I now hand over to Professor Susie Geiger from UCD.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you so much, Imelda and Mina, for giving us this opportunity, this podium, to not only discuss our papers, but also publish them and publish them open access. I think in this world, this is very much appreciated. So thank you for that. I'm going to be really brief. I'm only going to give you a little taster of what this paper is about. And as Imelda said, this is a paper that squarely focuses on the temporality of pharmaceutical patents. And, you know, the easy answer to, well, what temporality is involved in pharmaceutical patents for lawyers is always 20 years, because that's the nominal duration of any patent period, as everybody here knows. But I would argue that the temporality of pharmaceutical patents and the temporal political economy, as I term it in the paper, is a little bit more complex. And what I'm trying to do in the paper is to highlight this temporal political economy of pharmaceutical patents as one of the core roots for a lot of these ailments that we've seen the pharmaceutical industry basically promulgating in the world. So my first objective in the paper is to connect many of the symptoms of an arguably ailing pharmaceutical system that lets the publics down to the temporality of patenting, which really briefly I understand to tie a specific past determined by a particular narrative around who's doing pharmaceutical R&D and who's financing it, to a predetermined future, not just the 20-year patent monopoly that allows amortization of these investments, but also a narrative future that I call a future perfect, where the industry likes to argue that if there's any tampering with the patent system and this temporality that the patent system involves, then we will face a barren, chilled future with no pharmaceutical R&D. The main purpose then of my paper is not just to highlight the temporal political economy of pharmaceutical patents, but also to sketch, and it's only a sketch at this point, to sketch ways to decolonize the pharmaceutical future from this patent bind, as we might call it. And I briefly outlined 4 possibilities in which to do that. I also use the mRNA, the case of the mRNA vaccines during COVID-19 as a case in point to illustrate some of my arguments. So briefly, what is the paper about? It's basically arguing that, you know, in the good old world of vertical, no, we'll go back to, please. You're far too fast for me. In the good old world of vertical integration, a pharmaceutical company did a load of R&D investment. They got a drug or drug candidate, they got a patent, and they had the 20-year time frame to amortize or whatever is left of that patent period by the time marketing authorization is gained. They had that time to amortize R&D investments in a monopoly market. Meanwhile, the disclosure function of the patent would allow generic manufacturers to prepare to come into the market and lower prices when the patent period is over. My argument is that in a world where pharmaceutical innovation is predominantly taking place in often really complex innovation networks involving smaller biotechs, public research institutions, public-private partnerships, and a myriad of other players, and a lot of the time, significant public investment, this whole patent bargain that I'm trying to sort of sketch here with my, very rudimentary graphic skills is no longer valid, really, because what we're seeing is that we have essentially two markets. We have markets for patents upstream, where big pharma really only comes in later stage pharmaceutical innovation and buys up promising drug candidates, which then allows them to monopolize a downstream market in pharmaceutical production and manufacturing that they really didn't gain or deserve, so to speak, from the upstream investment that they did. So we see that, next slide, please. We see that very well with the mRNA example. The mRNA vaccine, that a lot of the time the narrative goes, oh, it's sort of, it was enabled by this incredible investment and energy that pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna put in, and they saved the world. Obviously, the temporality behind mRNA vaccines is a little bit more complicated than that. It leads us all the way back to the 1960s when mRNA was first discovered. It takes us through all sorts of ups and downs of a lot of academics trying to make our mRNA work for various different applications. It brings us into a period in the 2000s where there's a lot of spin-out activities, and the first biotech dedicated to mRNA discovery emerged, such as BioNTech and Moderna, incidentally. And it also takes us through 2015, where we actually had a viable vaccine candidate for Ebola, which wasn't deemed a lucrative market at the time by those who had invested privately in mRNA. Importantly, it takes us through a whole load of public investments, especially by the National Institutes of Health. Come 2020, we all know what happened. $18 billion in Operation Warp Speed, again, temporality right there, that accelerates all of the sort of the late stage marketing processes, regulatory processes, and within 11 months, we have a market ready product in terms of the mRNA COVID vaccines. Now, what happens is that this year, actually in 2020, 2021, also predetermined a 20+ year future, because the patents that were taken out or that were allocated to the mRNA technologies at the time were extremely broad. Again, that sort of serves as capturing or colonizing, as I argue in the paper, of the future. That is now very firmly in the hands of a very few companies that, for instance, did not contribute to the WHO mRNA vaccine hub in South Africa, that still refuse to contribute to that hub, and that really haven't done much else than accumulate a lot of profit for the companies in question. So what can we do? In a nutshell, how can we break this temporality of pharmaceutical patents? In the paper, next slide, please, I propose 4 different pathways. The first and the most easy one really is temporally sensitive policy making, especially in pandemic situations. We really need to make sure that the whole world is being served by the same medical technologies, synchronically. So that synchronicity that was so lacking during COVID-19 is absolutely essential. And we need to put mechanisms in place for policymakers to allow for that synchronicity to happen. The second pathway is decolonizing the future through narrow patents. So the broader the patent, the more of the future is colonized by private monopoly markets. And mRNA vaccines, again, the breadth of those that were given, allocated in 2020 are a case in point. So I'm arguing in the paper very much for patent offices to make sure that they only allocate patents to relatively narrow as possible medical technologies. The third pathway then is to simply and quite radically de-link the two markets, upstream markets for patents and the downstream market for medicines, because that financial link is broken anyway, I would argue. So we might as well de-link them through mechanisms such as price funds, innovation vouchers, innovation funds. There are several experiments currently happening in this to this effect that I think are very, very interesting and worth following up on and investing in from a public perspective. And finally, my most radical pathway is to common pharmaceutical innovation and production. And this is also where my current research actually sits, very much arguing in favor of public pharma, of public investments remaining in public hands, or at least being handed over to private players with a very heavy and lengthy list of conditionalities when it comes to availability, accessibility, and affordability of these drugs. That's it for me. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Susie. So continuing the theme of pharmaceuticals and access to medicine, now hand over to Pramiti.
Thank you so much. And first of all, a big thank you to Mina and Imelda for putting together the symposium, and also to Mary and Charlotte for organizing this webinar. So as we said, continuing again with the theme of pharmaceuticals. So this is a paper that I wrote together with Katrina Perehudov and Anik Tarauta. Essentially, our central argument is that we looked at the European regulatory bodies, specifically the European Medicines Agency, or the EMA, and the European Patent Office, and arguing that these bodies engage in outreach activities which have the result of increasing trust in their regulatory output, and increasing their influence by outside of their borders. So increasing how regulators in other jurisdictions would use the output of these agencies. And specifically in the context of low and middle income countries, we argue that this trust and regulatory influence are often unidirectional, flowing only from European bodies towards the low and middle income countries. And this unidirectional trust and regulatory influence can potentially have several market-making effects in LMICs, which then impact access to medicines in those countries. If you could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So we essentially identified several pathways for outreach for both the EMA and the EPO. And essentially through these pathways, these regulatory bodies are able to encourage other regulators in other jurisdictions, specifically here in LMICs, to rely on the output of the EMA and the EPO. So of course this, and we also argue that this kind of builds over time, going from more informal to more formalized pathways with time and more frequent interaction. So it can start off with something as just as simple as technical assistance or capacity buildings, trainings, online web sessions, webinars, etc., even capacity building sessions, etc. And over time, this becomes more formalized through bilateral procedures or regional procedures. We also have international pathways For example, in the case of medicines approval through the WHO pre-qualification or the emergency use listing or collaborative registration procedures, or for example, in the case of the EPO through the WIPO patent cooperation treaties, etc. And the idea is that these international pathways essentially position certain regulatory authorities, in this case the EMA and the EPO, as trustworthy regulatory authorities and further propound reliance on the output of these authorities. And as a result of these international pathways, not only will, say, for example, the WHO rely on the EMA's decisions through, say, its emergency use listing procedure, but it also encourages other countries, and especially LMICs, to rely on the decision making by the EMA or the EPO. So one of the classic examples of this can be seen, for example, during COVID, where the BioNTech vaccine was the first one to receive emergency use listing by the WHO. And this was done on the sole basis of the conditional marketing authorization of the EMA. And the conditional marketing authorization by the EMA came, I think, a month before. And then within a month, it received emergency use listing approval by the WHO. And lastly, you also, as I said, have more formalized procedures. So for example, in the EMA, we're probably all familiar with the Article 58 procedure, where the EMA essentially provides a scientific opinion on the suitability of specific medicines that are not meant for use within the European Union, but are meant for use outside of the European Union. And in practice, these are often meant for use within LMICs. When it comes to the European Patent Office, they have these validation agreements and reinforced partnership programs that they sign with countries outside of the EPO. So a validation agreement, for example, could look like a partner country agreeing to just validate the patents that are granted by the EPO in their own respective territories. So an applicant or a patent holder that has already received a patent by the EPO can then go to one of the partner countries that have signed a validation agreement with the EPO and simply ask for their patent to be validated and therefore enforceable also in the other country, only on the basis of the EPO patent and no more substantive investigation in these other countries. I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. And so we sort of explored the impact that this has on pharmaceutical markets and pharmaceutical access, specifically in LMICs. Now, of course, these come with significant efficiency gains, and that's also kind of the underlying premise of many of these reliance pathways in regulatory approval and in patenting activity. Essentially, this would lead to faster access, avoid duplication of activities, and this is, of course, hugely important, especially in resource-constrained settings, so where LMICs maybe don't have a huge amount of resources, whether it's financial or human resources. This can be quite helpful, especially again in pandemic situations or health crisis where time, as we said, temporal, the temporal aspect of it is quite important. So then again, that efficiency gain matters quite a lot. It can also incentivize companies to enter markets in LMICs. And then lastly, we've also seen that this can have positive effects on capacity buildings in LMICs, with regulators learning by doing and learning by observing. So you have gains in capacity building as well. And while there are many benefits of these, and we're not arguing that these benefits of course exist and have huge impacts and gains for pharmaceutical access as well, we do identify several sort of areas of caution. And these come from the fact that countries, especially LMICs, can often have very different local needs, very different strategic priorities, and even different legal frameworks as compared to, say, the EU, as compared to the EU in this case. So as an example, the EU or the European Patent Office has signed a validation agreement with Lao PDR, whereas any pharmaceutical company that has a patent in the EPO can then go and ask for this pharmaceutical patent to be validated in Laos. Now, the issue arises that as per the TRIPS agreement, Laos was not supposed to have provided, or was not required to have provided pharmaceutical patents yet until it graduates from the LDC status. But under this validation agreement, pharmaceutical patents can then be indeed granted in Laos PDR, undermining the TRIPS flexibility that was available to this country. And so that's an example of how simply kind of copy-paste kind of institutionalized reliance may undermine the use of TRIPS flexibilities and essentially undermine access to pharmaceutical products in LMICs. There is, of course, also a fear that where these decisions are simply being copy-pasted, or the dominant narrative is the EU knows best and developed countries know best, just copy the same and just do the same, that can hamper independent decision making and regulatory capabilities. And the very last thing is that our hypothesis, which this requires more empirical research, but the hypothesis is that this has significant market shaping effects as well in LMICs, with this kind of reliance primarily benefiting existing pharmaceutical companies, the more powerful pharmaceutical companies in the global north, which have already either received patents from the EPO or are clients of the EMA. They can then sort of use these reliance pathways to enter LMIC markets, undermining or potentially making it a bit more difficult for new entrants from LMICs to then gain access to those markets as well. So those are essentially some areas of caution. While benefits still exist, there is an important focus on developing independent regulatory capabilities and independent decision-making in LMICs, rather than simply kind of copy-pasting the EMA or the EPO's decisions in this case. There should be a QR code on the screen just right now yes, thank you. And if you're interested in reading the article, you can read the article and all the other articles of the symposium, of course, on this link. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pramiti. So, moving on again. Now we have Katrina, who's joining us from Amsterdam.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all and to be part of this really interesting symposium. I'm going to briefly sketch out the main ideas and arguments behind my paper on the EU's extraterritorial obligations for global access to medicines. And maybe I can move to the next slide, please.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
So the puzzle behind this paper is acknowledging that the EU's actions and policy has a number of external impacts on pharmaceutical markets and patients' access in territories beyond the EU. But the legal responsibilities of the EU with regards to extraterritorial medicines access those responsibilities are vague, and that's also what we saw in the COVID pandemic. There's a lot of debate about what appropriate EU actions would be. Do we donate medicines? Do we donate money? Do we provide the know-how so that medicines can be made elsewhere in the world? And so the whole impetus behind this project is to really come to a set of legal responsibilities that the EU has. And that's no small challenge, because there are these overlapping instruments in EU law, which is the piece that's just off the screen. The yellow icon there is meant to indicate EU law, so human rights responsibilities found in EU law and the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU. There you see some promising provisions. However, the main provision on access to medical services is constrained by the limits of national law, which makes it a bit difficult to understand how that might be applied in an extraterritorial situation. And in addition to that, there's very little case law that would help us think through how the courts might interpret the Charter of Fundamental Rights in case of EU action impacting extraterritorial medicines access. So then I move to the other instruments you see on the screen. Those are indicated in white. Those are international law instruments. The European Convention on Human Rights has this still an unclear relationship with the European Union and its institutions. which makes it a bit more difficult to apply in this case. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has one of the most specific interpretations of the right to health and the right to science that relate to access to medicines. So in that way, they can be very instructive as, for example, guiding principles of EU law, but the instrument is not legally binding on the European institutions as such, which limits its, legal applicability in this case. And so that leaves me with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is the core focus of this paper, because it holds several promising elements. One element is that it is part of EU law because the EU has ratified the instrument, and it's the only human rights treaty, the international human rights treaty, that the EU has done that for. So on the next slide, I move further into why we should think that the EU has these external responsibilities. And that's because EU law and policy has external influence, which can trigger a set of de facto responsibilities. We typically talk about the EU's external trade and aid agenda as having impact on global access to medicines, but research has also shown that there's a number of EU internal market laws and decisions that are made that also impact on the access to medicines that people have externally. Next slide, please. So accepting that the EU has certain binding obligations beyond its borders, this paper sort of goes in search of what those obligations might be. The text is all different sizes, it doesn't really matter. Because the point is that if we focus on the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we see that the obligations enshrined in that instrument track the EU's own competences. So where the EU has legal competence and power to act in areas that are covered by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, then certain binding obligations come along with that. And two areas that are relevant for medicines are, of course, the right to health, where the convention indicates that there's a right to access health services that minimize and prevent further disability, which in the field of access to medicines can have very wide applicability. Many patients with certain conditions, if you think of, for example, rare diseases, but also others, require medicines in order to prevent deterioration of their condition. And those sorts of situations would be caught by this instrument. And then beyond that, while the convention applies to internal domestic issues, it also has a very clear duty of international cooperation. And that includes, as the instrument says, taking actions to facilitate technology transfer, but also information sharing, exchange of research and knowledge on assistive technologies, for example. So there are many provisions here that can be related to the field of access to medicines, and in particular, those upstream steps that Susie was just speaking about that are so important for ensuring access in other corners of the world. Now, when it comes to enforcing these obligations, there's no international court adjudicating over the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. There's only a reporting body to the UN, which the EU is bound to do, and that carries certain, say, reputational risks or threats if potential violations are addressed there, but that is the sort of political power that this instrument holds. That's where it ends. There's also a relatively strong enforcement possibility because the UN Convention is part of the EU's own legal order, which means it could be enforced through EU courts, but that until now has been very scarcely applied. Nevertheless, the instrument remains an important source of guiding principles for EU institutional action on access to medicines that goes beyond Europe's borders, and this has been a missing piece of the conversation in global access to medicines throughout the COVID pandemic. So I think that's one of the main contributions that it makes. And the tail end of the paper also starts to think through the application of this line of thinking to two different cases. One internal market case looking at the EU's large-scale joint procurement of COVID vaccines and the impact it had, that purchase had beyond the EU's borders. And the second case is an external case of the EU's BioNTech technologies that it was facilitating in Rwanda. In that case, the facts that I think through there are largely based on fact-finding that media has done that I really appreciated integrating into that piece of this paper. So with that, I believe that is just a taste of what the proposal that this paper makes, and I'd be happy to discuss any ideas or suggestions you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katrina. So that sort of concludes the section on sort of pharmaceutical-related papers, if I can just put it in those broad terms. We're now moving on to more of a focus on pandemic responses. So, and our first speaker here is Hosseini von Minguth.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to both publish in this special issue, which was really great to have, and the workshops, thanks to Imelda and Mina, and also to the seminar series. So again here, I'm just going to give a very high-level overview of some of the main arguments in this paper. And if I could just move to the next slide, if that's okay.
Yep, of course.
Thank you. So this paper really started with an interest, as I know many in this webinar have as well, and many in the field have, on what happened during the pandemic, really, and what's not just specific to the pandemic, but with the pandemic, I think, is an exemplar of this, of the extreme levels of inequity in relation to health technologies, particularly at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the slide here is actually an image from the UN Global Dashboard. And I've taken this image from work I'd done previously. It's their dashboard at 2023, because I think at that time, interestingly, they had this graph image which was showing the rate of global access across low, middle income, high income countries, but they also had it broken down on the right, you can see, which shows the kind of rate of vaccination in the high income countries versus the low income countries. And obviously this is, vaccination uptake is a complex dynamic and picture. So I'm not suggesting that IP is the only factor here that's of relevance, but I do think when we look at the rate of securing the vaccines, especially in the early stages on that graph in 2021, when they first became available, and we see the uptake in the low-income countries versus the upper and middle-income countries, you can see the stark reality. And that is, I think most would agree, I think all would agree, down to the availability of those vaccines at the start of the pandemic. And you can even see as we go through kind of the early stages of the pandemics into 22, bringing along to 23, there's still very clear differences between those. And during the pandemic, we know now, and many had predicted indeed at the time, which is one of the motivations for the COVID-19 waiver of intellectual property rights, there was discussion around how intellectual property rights could impact vaccine rollout and also vaccine accessibility. And if we could just move to the next slide, please. So the paper really tries to focus on what was happening in that time and uses COVID-19 as a case study, more or less, to probe more deeply the role of intellectual property rights in this context. And within it, I'm not suggesting IP are the only factors, but I do believe that they are a very real key factor in why we ended up in a situation where we had such nationalistic, individualistic policies around access to vaccines at a time when the other reality was, in order to maintain vaccination, in order to try and seek to maximize the benefits of vaccination, the health research was suggesting and showing that you needed to have kind of maximum rollout across the most number of countries to have vaccinations to have the most effect. So actually this policy, or this approach to it, in terms of states focusing on their own interests first, and European groups and others focusing on their own regional interests first in terms of obtaining as much vaccines as possible for their states or regions, arguably it was contrary to the actual health needs at the time, and it could have had an even more devastating result, and indeed it did have devastating results in certain contexts. So I think a key factor here, the paper suggests, is the role of intellectual property rights as key governance devices. They enable rights holders, I would argue, to occupy this governance role. Because effectively, despite the fact, as Susie's papers and others' papers in this issue highlight, the huge public funding that went into the development of many of these vaccinations and many of these COVID health technologies, much of that didn't attract conditions to how the IP was used. So in most instances, in reality, the rights holders' companies had free rein effectively to determine how they were going to use their IP rights and whether or not they would voluntarily license it to initiatives like the COVID Technology Access Pool was left up to their discretion. There was no binding conditions despite the public funding there. And I think that is a key issue and a key lesson from this context. But also it meant that effectively rights holders who had the IP could dictate who could gain access first and on what terms to the vaccines. And we saw a huge scrambling from the time that the first vaccines were approved, which countries would gain access first. And in most cases, the high and middle income countries gained that access first. And many have written about this. But what I'm particularly interested in here is, and in the paper, I talk about how I believe that that system has institutionally embedded an approach which is going to lead to these nationalistic, individualistic approaches to be maintained unless we actually tackle some of the institutional factors leading to this. And I think this will be even more likely that it would happen actually in global health emergency contexts. And there's certain factors that lead to this. And I think when you bring them all together, the paper argues that you end up with this perfect storm within which it's almost in each of the actors that have the control currently, it's almost in all of their interests that this individualistic approach would be maintained. And it's actually only, in my view, by seeking to tackle that broader legal and political system that we would have effective change, and that the initiatives that we're seeking now, we're seeing now, like the pandemic treaty or the pandemic agreement, that those will actually have real effect. So some of the factors I talk about in the paper, just to sketch them briefly here, legally intellectual property rights holders, that's those that have patents or other types of IP that are relevant to vaccines and health technologies. Many of those are companies, and in most legal systems, companies, one of their key legal drivers is in relation to shareholder interests, and that's often interpreted, doesn't have to be interpreted this way, I would argue, but it often is interpreted as meaning that that should lead towards profit maximization. So it's arguably in the interests of the rights holders to seek the best price for their technology, and that then would mean that they would seek to distribute the technology that's patented to those who can offer the best terms, the best agreements to it. Alongside that, states themselves, and we've just heard on this, the broader extraterritorial obligations that could apply in many instances, but arguably in a pandemic context, states and the political actors within them, they have a duty, a legal duty to their citizens, and that is often what there is a political pressure for them to address, and you can see why that is the case, and it's very understandable that citizens and those within a state would want access to COVID vaccines first. They would want to know about when they're getting access in a crisis like this, and when is it going to happen for them and for their families, and that's very understandable that that would happen. But that is also leading to a situation that states or regions, again, are seeking access first, and that's kind of working together with the rights holders to suggest that states would almost bid more to get access to that first. And in a status quo is more likely, we know from institutional theories, to be observed when you have an emergency context and there's a state of uncertainty. Then states and other actors are more likely to follow typical patterns of behaviour, which would be to put their citizens first. And the other thing, and I don't have time really to go into this, but I'm happy to discuss further later, is that the mechanisms that would counter this, such as human rights, often those are applicable, like the right to health, there's other rights, the right to science, and one might argue that those should be effective in countering this. But for various reasons, there is problems around the enforcement of those rights at a supranational level. There's also the way in which the right to health could be pitted against the right to IP, and there's various different silos that make that type of argument quite difficult, especially in a timely context, to effectively make. So then I show in the paper how not only have we seen these issues in the COVID-19 context, we also again see this happening in the strategies to address future pandemics, like the World Health Organization's pandemic agreement. In the drafting process, some of the original provisions on IP were far stronger than the final text. So we see a watering down over time of that text, particularly on those provisions. And I would argue that whilst it does leave some scope for them to be interpreted in a way that could achieve better equitable access to vaccines and other technologies in time, there's much discretion left in that agreement now, and it is far much more less effective or more watered down than we saw in an earlier draft. And I would suggest that again there we're seeing vaccine nationalism appearing within that treaty. So then the paper in the final section argues that if we are really serious about change in this context, we need to have some sort of rethinking and reconceptualization of the system. And one of the ways that I argue that that should happen is a recognition that it's not that rights holders are important and intellectual property rights are one part of that broader incentivization system in terms of health innovation, but they are not the only actors, that there's a huge range of actors and resource providers that are needed in order for one to have effective health technologies. Those include the importance of public research funders. They include the importance of states, including around the advanced purchase agreements that were used to fund some of the speedier development of these vaccines during COVID-19. They also include the role of universities as key knowledge providers for that basic scientific research that's fed in often over decades into the research that underpins the development of these novel health technologies. And there's also members of the public who are paying for the public funding, but not alone that, they're also participating in health research, providing biosamples that are critical here as well. So I would argue that there has to be a greater institutional recognition of these actors, and that those actors could play a key role by having conditionality, including legal conditionality to their contributions here, which would effectively seek to take away the full control from the rights holders and to level that across all of these actors who are integral to the development of vaccines or other health technologies. But for that to be effective, the paper proposes that collective action is needed. So it's not enough for one university or another university to do this, but actually we need to see a collective of universities, a collective of research funders, a collective of states doing this, because strength in numbers is often more effective in such contexts. And in doing so, I would argue a key part of this is attaching conditions in the licensing agreements and IP agreements in terms of ensuring downstream accessibility of these technologies. And just the next slide. So that's just to conclude, very high level, the main arguments, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Okay, thank you very much, Hosseini. So linking together sort of a pandemic response and going to the next section on competition policy, I give the floor to Mina.
Thank you so much, Mary and Charlotte, for organizing this webinar. So my paper focused on EU COVID-19 vaccine strategy. And the EU vaccine strategy launched in June 2020 followed ambitious goals, as you can see: safety, affordability, equitable access, global solidarity. And as part of these, they introduced or reintroduced these advanced purchase agreements, or APA, and through this centralized APA, the Commission negotiated on behalf of the member states to avoid intra-EU competition and increase bargaining power. This approach delivered some success, notably securing large vaccine volume pretty quickly. And however, this experience also exposed structural tensions in transparency, accountability, and also market power that we need to focus more. So next slide, please. So as part of this paper, I tried to focus on EU-AstraZeneca agreement as a case study. This EU-AstraZeneca APA provides a particularly revealing case study because the Commission signed this agreement in August 2020 for up to 400 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine. However, there are several problems soon emerged after that. First, delivery shortfalls triggered a legal dispute between the EU and AstraZeneca, and also highlighting a clause, a pretty problematic one, best reasonable effort clause. So basically the AstraZeneca pharmaceutical company, they argued that it's not, many of these clauses are not binding agreement, or just like best reasonable effort clauses. And also rather than supply commitments, such clauses gave manufacturer in general significant flexibility in meeting obligation, which proved problematic in a mass vaccination context, and also in a global pandemic could be very problematic having this approach. Also, there were many arguments regarding this case study and also other APAs with other pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer about transparency and accountability from public institution and also from a pharmaceutical company. So the transparency deficit in this case became evident, like key pricing and liability provisions were heavily redacted, raising concerns about public oversight and trust. And there are several cases against the Commission because of these transparency deficit. And also, these pandemic conditions amplified somehow produces leverage. So they raise important questions regarding equitable allocation of risk between public authorities and also private manufacturer. Next slide, please. Because of all of these, I argue that these shortcomings, to address these shortcomings, I propose the PHASER framework, a 5-pillar model for future vaccine governance. So in first pillar, fairness through equitable procurement, I argue that this pillar emphasizes transparent pricing, balance, risk allocation, and also global solidarity, because fairness has like a somehow broad definition. Fairness must extend beyond the EU to avoid reinforcing global vaccine inequities. As we heard from several speakers today, that this equity and this objective, EU objective, is just like, it's not limited to the EU. In my second pillar, the second pillar of this PHASER framework, which is about accountability, transparency in vaccine procurement, I emphasize that public trust depends on meaningful disclosure and also oversight. Litigation before the EU courts, several litigation that I explained in detail in this paper, has already showed that the legal importance has already showed the legal importance of access to this information, because it was actually it was taxpayers' money, and it was this contract was from was on behalf of member states from a public institution and a pharmaceutical company, several pharmaceutical companies. In our third pillar, I introduced competition law in vaccine procurement and the importance of competition law in the context of EU vaccine policy, because the pandemic revealed this significant bargaining power of a small number of vaccine producers. So embedding competition rules and also Article 101 and 102 TFEU more explicitly into crisis procurement and crisis management and vaccine procurement and governance can help prevent excessive pricing, discriminatory supply, and market foreclosure, because it's a tool that we already have that. So we can use it as like an effective tool in that context and in the context of EU vaccine policy. And also the fourth pillar is the ethics of innovation in vaccine development. So where vaccines are heavily publicly funded, IP rights carry like social responsibility and mechanism such as compulsory licensing, such as IP flexibility, as Aisling mentioned also in her paper. We can use these tools to justify and to like combat these severe health emergencies. So I argue that we have this innovation, we have different tools to protect that innovation, but with innovation, you also have ethics of innovation, specifically in a very sensitive context like a health emergency and vaccine development. So we have to focus on not only the legal aspect of that IP rights, but also on ethical aspects of having that innovation. And it's very important, this ethics of innovation in vaccine development, I believe is very important now because the new approach of the European Commission is to increase competitiveness, and it's a pretty pro-innovation approach, which is not bad per se, but we have to consider especially when we are talking about public health, we have to consider these ethical aspects of that pro-innovation approach. And the fifth pillar and final pillar of this PHASER framework is resilience against systemic distortion, which future preparedness requires diversified supply chains, stronger industrial coordination, and reduce dependency on limited sources. And also this resilience also echoed in the recent Draghi reports and also the competitiveness compass. So this must be part of that holistic approach when we are talking about having a holistic approach to pandemic preparedness and to pandemic management, and to a more successful EU vaccine strategy for the next health crisis. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mina. So continuing our competition law theme, we now hand over to Carmen and Enrique.
Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon for Enrique and I. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be here today in this remarkable symposium. We would like to express our sincere gratitude to the organizer, Mary and Charlotte, and especially to Professor Imelda Maher and Mina Hosseini for their constant trust and support. In the next few minutes, we would like to walk you through a case that has become a reference point in the intersection between patent litigation and competition law. It is the decision issued by the Spanish Competition Authority on October 21st, 2022, sanctioning Maher, Sharp and Young for abuse of a dominant position. At first glance, this might look like a typical patent dispute, but the real significance of the case lies in something deeper. How a dominant company can misuse judicial procedures not to defend its right, but to strategically delay competition. So let me set the scene very briefly. Maher held the patent for Novarin, a contraceptive product sold in Spain, and when a smaller pharmaceutical company attempting to introduce a competing product, Maher reacted not with a single well-founded legal claim, but with a sequence of procedural actions, injunctions, appeals, objections, and administrative challenges. Now, each of these actions was legally possible. None of them were unusual, but the Spanish Competition Authority found something crucial. They were extremely weak on the merits. In other words, Merck knew that these actions were unlikely to succeed. Instead, they wanted to buy time. And this is where the competition problem emerges. Every procedural step for regulators and courts to pause, resist, or suspend authorization. Its delay, whether a few weeks or a few months, puts the competitor's market entry further into the future. And in the pharmaceutical sector, as you know, time is money. Even a short delay can preserve monopoly rents, maintain higher prices, and keep rivals out of the market. The Spanish Competition Authority concluded that Merck's behavior was not a legitimate defense of its patent. It was a coordinated exclusionary strategy, a strategy designed to exploit the company's dominant position by wearing down a smaller competitor, one that did not have the financial strength or the legal resources to withstand years of litigation.
Thank you, Carmen. This brings us to the central legal principle. Everyone has the right to go to effective judicial protection, but competition laws aligned a limit in that. Dominant firms cannot weaponize that right to exclude competitors. When legal procedures are used not to protect innovation but to obstruct market entry, the conduct becomes abusive. In this case, in our paper, the infringement can be summarized in a single sentence. Merck used weak but repeated legal action to deliberately delay a competitor's entry, turning procedural rights into a tool of exclusion rather than a legitimate defense. Why does this matter beyond the specific of the case? Because competition law is concerned with effects, not just formal legality, potential or not with effect. And the effect here were clear: delayed competition, reduced consumer choice, limited the choice, and the preservation of monopoly profit. More broadly, the case reminds us that the courts and competition authorities must remain vigilant. The judicial system must not become a strategic barrier in the hands of dominant firms. Finally, this decision reinforces a fundamental balance. We must protect the right to go to court, but we must also prevent its misuse. When legal tools are deployed as obstacles rather than safeguards, they undermine both competition in a side and the integrity of the judicial progress in the other. Thank you very much, but we have another conclusion. Is the broader lesson of that is the competition law protects market from strategic distortion and distortion also in the courts. Finally, I would like to thank you for inviting me to participate and congratulate you on organizing this type of conference, which sure improves competitiveness by sharing ideas and strategies at an international level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrique and Carmen. So we now hand over to Lukasz. to tell us a bit more about EU competition law.
Oh, thank you, Mary, very much. I would like first to thank you and Charlotte for organizing this webinar. And I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Mina and Imelda for inviting me to this project. It's always a pleasure to become a part of the team of wonderful, distinguished colleagues. I'm grateful for this. So my paper is focused on the notion of undertaking within the scope of healthcare and public healthcare. And my main objective was in fact to examine how the way in which the concept of undertaking is applied in this sector, how this affects Polish healthcare or public healthcare sector, as Polish healthcare sector is apparently quite original, and I will try to describe it a little bit. But let me first start with certain conclusions of my paper. So in my paper, I claim that first, the development of the case law of the Court of Justice led us to distinguish two separate concepts of undertaking. One, which is general and is based on the concept of competition or existing of a market. And the second is sector specific, existing in the area of public healthcare and other sectors that are organized on the basis of social solidarity. And in my opinion, at least, the two concepts are very hard to reconcile today. And development of these two concepts, of course, it does not have any support in the treaty, and it may result in certain problems, in certain issues, when we look at specificity of some healthcare systems, including Polish system. If I may ask to go to the next slide.
Of course, certainly.
So how this affects Polish system? First, let me now describe a little bit how it works. So in Poland, we do not have a competition in the area of sickness funds. We have one single public sickness fund, which is called NFZ, something like NHS in the UK. Though we have a different way in which the contracts are provided or the services are provided. Because on the one side, of course, we have contributions by employees and retirees and contributions from state budget, but then we have NFZ, which is contracting for services. And here you can observe three types of tenders, of negotiations, or the manners in which contracts are concluded. If I can ask for another slide. So basically we have three ways. The first, it's about tenders. And NFZ organizes public tenders in which both public and private providers compete. And these can be for-profits, non-profits, and the criteria used here by NFZ are quality of services, comprehensiveness, accessibility, continuity of care, and also price. So you have a classic competition mechanism here. Then we have an exemption from the principle that tenders must be organized, which are negotiations. So in specific situations, NFZ is also entitled to negotiate contracts with providers, both still public, private, for-profit, non-profit, in which we have some kind of competitive negotiations with at least 3 participants, if this is only possible. And here we also have some kind of an competitive process. And then we have the so-called hospital lists, so the lists of hospitals that are usually like they are created by the NFZ, and in doing which NFZ uses the criteria of the scope of services, and price and quality is also relevant. And if you look at these three elements, in all of them we have competition, and if you apply a general concept of undertaking, all these providers and all of these transactions would be considered covered by competition law, by EU competition rules. But if you apply sector-specific approach, which actually brought us now to exemption from competition rule of the public healthcare sector, the situation is totally different. And the question is, can we observe now with this approach to the notion of undertaking distortions of competition in these areas? And in fact, I believe we can. Please go to the next slide. So if we look at, we can look at this problem from the point of view of antitrust and state aid. If you look from the point of antitrust, then if you've got competition in tenders, but at the same time, these tenders are not covered with EU competition law, there is a risk of increased amount of cartels, increased number of cartels, group boycotts, bid rigging, and so forth and so on. And this happened in practice. Like in 2012, we had a case before our competition authority in which 9 public hospitals in Lublin, one of the biggest city in eastern Poland, 9 of these hospitals were engaged in group boycott of their private counterpart in the framework of one of the tenders organized by NFZ. So it happened, and now there is a case of whether this type of an approach, which lead us probably, as we understand it, to exclusion of public healthcare providers from the scope of competition law, would bring mean that this type of market conduct will be tolerated. Then we had the problem with state aid, because we have public and private providers, but if the relationship between public and private, between public owner and public provider is neutral from the point of view of competition law, so it is not covered by state aid rules, there is a risk of granting public financing totally out of control, and thus creating the advantage of public providers over private competitors. And in fact, I believe that at least with sectors like organized in the way we can observe in Poland, this type of approach of the European Court of Justice can bring to serious distortions of competition and to serious distortions of effectiveness of the system. That's basically all. I would gladly answer all your questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lukasz. Okay, so the last speaker is myself. Continuing on quite similar themes to what Lukasz has been discussing in terms of state aid rules and SGEI. So my interest more generally is typically around the limits of applying EU competition law to the healthcare sector. And that's not to say I think markets should be unregulated, quite the reverse. Simply that EU competition law may not always be the best or certainly the only way to do this. Indeed, healthcare I suggest elsewhere, may be too broad. Perhaps what we need to do is break it down further and think about different aspects of healthcare. We've seen interventions on pharmaceuticals today, for example. Within healthcare more generally, we might think in terms of provision, and within that still hospitals. Certainly when individual countries experiment with competition reforms, a lot of the attention is on hospitals, and perhaps as a result of this, some EU documentation includes hospitals as an example, for example, of SGEI. So there's been two recent developments that I comment on in the paper. One, so back in December 2022, the European Commission completed its review of state subsidy rules in the healthcare sector, particularly the use of the SGEI mechanism. So there's two broad ways of exception to the application of EU state aid rules. And one is, as Lucas indicated, the idea of finding of no economic activity, there is no undertaking. And the other is that effectively there is an undertaking, but the national authorities choose to designate it as a service of general economic interest, or SGEI. And that's identifying that certain providers, typically public providers, have particular public service obligations, which may not apply to private providers. So 2022, we have the Commission sort of calling for further clarity on where do we see undertakings in the healthcare context. And in April 2023, we get an answer of sorts with the Casa Regina Postolorum judgment of the Court of Justice. So it certainly provided some clarity. Some may say it provided an unsatisfactory answer. And so what my paper does is to try and see if there's a way through the sort of sense of an impasse which came out of the Casa Regina judgment. Is there a way forward in how we might analyse competition cases in the future, particularly regarding hospitals? So my slides are very brief and discuss more general aspects. I'm conscious that the audience includes people who are not competition lawyers, as well as getting into some of the more geeky, techie aspects there as well. So if we think of a healthcare system, from an EU perspective, we have Article 168.7 telling us healthcare system organisation is a member state competence. So it's at a national level, decisions are made about organisation of healthcare, whether there's more support given to public healthcare, the extent to which private healthcare may be incorporated within this. These are all sort of national decisions. And more across the member states, we see interactions between the two. And then various publications have developed this idea of 4 categories of healthcare. So the public healthcare system is made up of categories 1 and 2, and the private healthcare market categories 3 and 4. And where we see attention focusing in a competitional context, in the state aid context, is typically around categories 2 and 4, where we see the private providers operating. So I'm only going to give 2 examples here for reasons of time, 2 Italian cases as it happens, the Italian healthcare system being very much sort of public-focused healthcare system, but as with other countries, incorporating aspects of private healthcare in different ways as well. So we may see, for example, as we did in the Pickford case, a provider operating in category 4, and that's to say private clinic delivering services treating private patients. And it may also deliver services within the public healthcare system as well, so it's also operating in category 2. And in that case, the Commission decided that there was an undertaking, there was an economic activity. It was eventually excluded for other reasons, but the crucial thing today was an economic activity was found in that case. So we then get a case like Casa Regina, for example, where, again, we have private providers operating in category 2, sort of effectively, but the Court of Justice finds there's no economic activity involved there. So we start to unpack this and look at reasons why. The private providers in Casa Regina put forward the argument, well, not only is there private delivery of public services, there's also been reforms, including patient choice policies, typical flag of sort of marketisation policies. And not only that, the public healthcare system in Italy charges for certain treatment, so it's sort of straying into the private healthcare market there as well. And that line of argumentation was rejected by the Commission, in the first level appeal to the General Court, and then finally also by the Court of Justice. So I just wanted to say a bit more about how these hospital cases go. So that in general terms is, if you like, the context of what happens. A breakdown of the state aid prohibition, it's a prohibition, and then there's arguments for justifying the subsidy or the support being given to state providers usually. So we have 4 cumulative criteria, as you can see in a range of cases there. Different levels of attention are paid to these. For the most part, attention focuses on the question of an undertaking, as Lucas demonstrated, and the analysis stops there. It kind of buffers at that point. We don't seem to get much further always. But in some of these cases, other attention has been paid, for example, to the effect on trade between member states. So we see that in a case about hospitals in a border region between Czechia and Poland, for instance. And I would suggest that perhaps we need to think more about that. Remember, we're talking here about applying EU competition law. And that applies particularly with regard to state aid rules because there's no national equivalent to that legal regime. So perhaps a better, if not starting point, then at least giving more weight to the question of cross-border trade might be a way to sort of progress with these kinds of cases. This cross-border effect was also raised in a case about Brussels hospitals. Clearly much easier to establish a sense of cross-border effects there. You have patient mobility. If you think of the location of Brussels, you're going to potentially be drawing in patients from France, Germany, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands as well. So in the Brussels hospital case, they also flagged the idea of a threshold for meeting this cross-border requirement, and that included the sense of cross-border mobility, which may be greater or lesser, depending on the region, and also the idea of a hospital having an international reputation because it offers highly specialist services. So there we get an interesting dynamic between, on the one hand, international reputation, that would seem to speak to the idea of affecting trade between member states, but highly specialised, I suggest, puts it rather more firmly in the sense of a solidarity basis. So what they were arguing in Casa Regina was essentially that there'd been this shift from a solidarity-based system in Italy to a competition-based one, and that was what was being rejected by the Commission, General Court, and Court of Justice. So if we work through those criteria, there is the final question of whether or not an SGEI has been designated with regard to particular activities. So as you can see in the Czechia case, the Brussels case, and also a German case, the SGI was raised. It was identified that the public providers had additional obligations which private providers didn't, for example. In the Casa Regina case, this SGI was not mentioned by the Italian authorities. It was, however, mentioned by the private provider. And that seems to be not enough for the Commission to accept this. If the national authority is raising SGI, then a lighter touch review is conducted. If not, then it goes to this full Article 107 review, and it may sort of get a bit stuck around the idea of an undertaking. So just to wrap up, where we're slightly over time already, in the title I talk about quiet power, and what I'm getting at there is this idea that it's not necessarily a top-down approach from the EU that we have in this situation, but from the member states informing that. In other words, the member states have a wide discretion. They have Article 168(7) saying it's the member states who organise their healthcare systems, and they also have discretion to define SGEI. So I think from Casa Regina, what we're left with is the sense that in hospital cases where there may not be a significant cross-border effect, which would attract EU-level interest, this is now simply seen as a matter for member states to resolve. Slightly different example which shows this quite well is the Dutch experience of introducing private health insurance, which was determined to be subject to Dutch competition law, but not EU competition law. Not necessarily to EU competition law. But there is still a role for the EU level to play in these cases, and that is by looking at how SGI are defined and whether or not the member states commit manifest error in doing this. We saw that briefly in Brussels hospitals, but there's more scope to explore that particular criterion. Okay, so last but not least today, we have question and answer. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, I'm also going to stop recording at this point to enable an easier discussion